Welcome to The Access. I'm your host, Hayvi Bouzo. In this episode, we'll be discussing the life and career of Marie Colvin, her targeted killing by the Assad regime, and the recent lawsuit that found the regime liable. We'll also discuss protections for journalists and how to hold regime like Assad's accountable in the future. To talk about all of this, we are joined by Scott Gilmore, lead attorney for the Colvin lawsuit. Thank you so much, Scott, for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
I want to start by obviously the big win, the first win of a case against the Assad regime for basically killing an American citizen, and that was the case for killing the American journalist Marie Colvin in Syria in 2012. Tell us a little bit more about this case. Why did you take it on? What made this case more maybe interesting for the people to follow, and made you were able to actually win a case against the Assad regime in the United States?
Yeah, so I started investigating the killing of Marie Colvin in 2012, just a few months after it happened. At the time, it was a bit of a mystery to people around the world as to what exactly happened. Marie was reporting with a group of Western journalists who were visiting Syria and reporting from a media center, the Baba Amr Media Center, which of course was run by very activists that became very famous, Khalid Abu Salah and others. And Marie gave a live broadcast on the night of February 21st, 2012, describing the siege of Baba Amr and describing the indiscriminate shelling of civilian areas, describing the deaths of children, describing women and children hiding in basements, and food being cut off, electricity cut off, medicine being cut off. And she also described it as a lie, that the regime was targeting terrorists. She said that she was reporting from inside Baba Amr. She said there were a very small number of rebels that were on the outside of the neighborhood trying to defend it, but the people really being hit by the shells were the civilians inside. And within a few hours after Marie gave those live broadcasts on BBC and CNN, there were shells, rockets that hit the house where the media center was operating and destroyed it. And Marie was killed along with a French photographer, Remy Ochlik. Several other people that were there, both Westerners and Syrians, were injured in the attack. And this was shocking. I mean, it was shocking to me because I was following Marie's reports. In my office in Washington, D.C., Marie was one of the journalists that was helping me understand what was happening in Syria in the early years, right? The first year when there was the uprising and then the hard military security crackdown against the uprising.
And people were not sure about what's happening.
Exactly. I mean, it's very difficult to understand because the official version from the Assad regime was that these were terrorists, or that there were no initially they said that there were no gunshots against the demonstrators, or that it was the demonstrators that were doing the shooting. And then soon it became so clear when you saw Syrian tanks being deployed, they couldn't really conceal that. So then the story shifted to that this was intervention by the United States or Israel or Saudi Arabia, other countries trying to finance terrorist groups and manipulate the whole thing. So I mean, this was the debate over the truth, over the reality. And it's an interesting situation because we see that still playing out in countries around the world where there are attacks on the media, there are autocratic governments like the Assad regime.
Yes, like the Russian regime, they try to keep circling around this story that this is what happened in Syria, not that the Assad regime was the one targeting civilians.
Exactly. And so I think that for Marie Colvin and for some of the other journalists who entered the country, this was an important opportunity for them to try to understand what was actually happening on the ground. And of course, as an objective journalist, you listen to both sides of the story, but you also respect your own eyes and ears.
Yes.
And I think that was so critically important about having foreign international journalists and observers entering Syria, because there's a certain credibility to an outsider visiting the country and seeing things versus a spokesperson from the government or necessarily an activist like Khalid Abu Salah, because they're impartial, because they're not a part of the actual conflict.
Exactly.
But that, I think, made the foreign journalists a major threat to the regime. And so the question for us at the time was, Was this a deliberate targeting? Did the regime know that Marie Colvin and the other journalists were at the media center? Was this just a stray rocket? I mean, there were a lot of rockets hitting the neighborhood. Was it just accidental that it happened to kill the journalists?
Yes. How, I mean, that was my next question.
Yeah.
How were you able to convince the judge here in the US that Marie Colvin was deliberately targeted by the Assad regime to get killed from this attack? I mean, how could you prove this?
Yeah. Well, we proved it through 6 years of evidence gathering, and we collected eyewitness accounts describing the shelling attack, describing the sounds of the incoming shells, describing the sites of it, describing the debris, the injuries. And then we also were able to find defectors, former members of the military services who were able to describe, first, just mapping out who was there, what military units were there, what were their priorities, what were their orders.
To attack Baba Amr on that specific day?
To attack Baba Amr in general, in
general.
February, just
In
to
February,
understand.
okay, so during that month.
Yeah, who's who, what military units were there, what were their operations. And then eventually, and this took years, but eventually we were able to find former members of the military that actually had contact with the planning of the attack that targeted Marie Colvin. And so we were able to learn exactly how the regime was intercepting Marie Colvin's broadcasts using satellite internet connections, and how they also had developed informants on the ground in Baba Amr. And the Mukhabarat received tips from these informants that Western journalists were at the media center, they received the location of the media center, and they used those two pieces of information, intercepting her broadcasts, intercepting phone calls.
Which could locate where she is.
Exactly, and then confirming that with informants on the ground. And that information they then fed to the artillery units that launched the attack. And so it's the evidence of that, the very specific intentional targeting of the journalists that we presented to the court. In order to corroborate that information, because it's only a couple witnesses, and how do you corroborate a few witnesses? Well, we were able to work with international investigators that have recovered more than 700,000 documents of the Assad regime.
700,000 documents.
Yes, 700,000
That's a lot of documents.
Many of them came from former offices of the Mukhabarat, the different branches, especially in the areas that were liberated. Right? The regime no longer had control of them. International investigators were able to go into, in some instances, former branch offices of the Mukhabarat and take the files, ship them in boxes out of the country.
Wow.
And they're being preserved now in an archive, in a safe, neutral country. Yes. So we were able to review documents from this collection. And we found evidence that, first of all, in August 2011, the Central Crisis Management Cell, which was a body created by the president himself, which included all of the heads of the different intelligence agencies, the Minister of Defense, Minister of Interior. They issued orders which were distributed around the country to both military and the intelligence, orders to target various members of the opposition, but particularly groups.
Like what?
Like those that were demonstrating, those that were organizing the demonstrations.
Okay, so specifically, we want you to target protesters.
Yes, protesters.
Organizers.
Organizing the protesters. And one of the things that was most damning was they specifically ordered military and security operations against anyone tarnishing the image of Syria in the international media. And so that meant that not just journalists, Syrian media activists, international journalists, but even Syrian citizens just
who are
on the phone, a camera on a phone. People that are taking a call to give an interview with Al Jazeera or with CNN. Those people became considered enemies of the state.
Exactly.
Simply because they're exercising their freedom of expression.
So what was the orders? To kill those people?
The orders were, well, the thing with the regime is that they're very careful.
Yes.
You will never see an authentic internal document from the regime saying, kill this person. What they say in coded language, launch military security operations against these individuals. What happens to them? Well, certainly some of them as we see, many thousands of people were arrested, detained, tortured, and then sometimes killed.
Yeah. Most of the time. I mean, we don't even know who was not killed.
I mean, many people, and many people disappeared. We don't know the
Yes, we
fates
don't know
of
exactly.
thousands of people in Syria. But the other scenario, particularly for priority targets that were in opposition areas where the regime couldn't easily arrest them, they would kill them. And they would kill them through launching targeted attacks. So we know that they distributed wanted orders for Syrian and foreign journalists at checkpoints. The checkpoints around Bab al-Amr, they had lists of media activists and journalists.
Their names.
Their names. They had awards offered. So if a soldier succeeded in capturing one of these journalists, they would get an award.
Oh, they would get an award. Okay.
Yeah. So we knew that this was not just an isolated attack against the media center in Bab al-Amr. We knew that it was part of an official state policy from the highest level. I mean, this would have been approved by the president. The president signed and approved the decisions of the Central Crisis Management Cell.
Yes.
And so that decision to authorize military operations against journalists was approved by the president.
By the president, by Bashar al-Assad.
By Bashar al-Assad. In August 2011, we have the documents.
From August 2011, that early?
That early, August 2011. And so what you saw was, in the months that followed, various attacks on journalists, arrests, people being rounded up. In February, just the week before Marie Colvin was killed, the Syrian intelligence forces raided the office of the Syria Center for Media and Freedom of Expression, Mazen Darwish, famous human rights lawyer.
Yes, of course.
His office was raided just a week before they killed Marie Colvin. This was the main office that was promoting freedom of the press and also collecting information and reporting on the disappeared.
Yes.
So I don't think it's a coincidence that within 2 weeks, the regime targeted the most prominent freedom of expression organization in Damascus and one of the most prominent media centers in Homs.
And prior to that, you had the orders to also target all of these segments of the Syrian society or foreigners who are doing the same specific things that the Assad regime viewed as threatening.
Exactly, exactly.
In your opinion, being able to prove these specific, systematic things that the Assad regime was doing, what do you think the implications of that, especially after winning the case of the deliberate killing of Marie Colvin, would be on the other cases of American citizens who were tortured to death, and certain cases, actually very recently, we've heard about a couple of them.
Yes.
And obviously there's others that you know of in general with other Syrians who are not American but internationally are known to be detained, tortured, killed, or targeted the same way Marie was.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the important things with our case, with Marie Colvin's case, first of all, we won. A judge reviewed all of the evidence, and this is a very well-regarded judge. This is Amy Berman Jackson at the federal court in Washington, D.C. She's the same judge.
Federal court.
Federal court. She's the same judge who's handling the prosecution of Paul Manafort, the former chairman of President Trump's campaign.
Yes.
She's also handling now the prosecution of Roger Stone. These are very prominent cases that she handles. So Judge Jackson reviewed the evidence that we presented, and in her decision, which was released just last week, she found that the evidence was credible. She found that the evidence was corroborated. And she found that Marie Colvin was killed as part of this policy, the Assad regime's policy of targeting journalists.
Yes.
And so I think the significance of that is, first of all, it's the very first time that a court has ever reviewed the evidence against the Assad regime.
Yes, an American court.
In any court.
In any court, not even, yes, because in the ones in Europe, the one in Spain did not, like what happened in that case when the sister filed for her brother?
Right, so those cases have not yet reached the trial phase.
Yes.
Right, where a judge or a jury actually reviews the evidence and decides whether they're guilty or innocent.
Yes.
In those cases filed in Europe, they're still being investigated. This is the first case in which a judge has actually reviewed the evidence and made a decision upon that evidence. And I think the significance for that is, one, it shows that, that the evidence is strong. It shows that the methods, For example, these international organizations that have been gathering documents, it shows that the methods of collection have been done professionally and that the evidence itself is credible. That is going to have an impact on future cases because I think it sends a signal to other lawyers, prosecutors, that there is sufficient evidence to build these types of cases against the regime.
Yes.
I think also the fact that the judge recognized that this was a policy, this wasn't a policy just of targeting Americans. This was a
or
policy
Marie Colvin specifically.
Exactly. This was a policy of targeting Syrians above all.
Yes.
And the judge recognized that it was a systematic attack.
Yes.
And that the Syrians were, in many instances, the primary victims. Now, unfortunately, because of the way that the law works, jurisdiction in the United States is usually limited to American citizens in terms of victims. So not every Syrian is going to be able to bring a case in the United States.
Yes.
But there have been several recent stories, as you mentioned, of Syrian Americans, dual citizens, that have been detained by the Assad regime. In one instance, a woman from, I believe, Chicago who was killed in custody. Another, a humanitarian worker and doctor who has disappeared.
Yes.
It might be possible to pursue justice for their families in a case similar to what Marie Colvin has done, or Marie Colvin's family have done, or there might be jurisdiction for the U.S. government to open a criminal investigation.
Why?
Because of the American citizenship of the victims.
Yes.
And so that's, unfortunately, that's usually the only method in which you could get jurisdiction in an American court. Otherwise, for a war crimes case, very often you have to look to an international court.
Yes, like The Hague.
Exactly.
Exactly. Would you take on these cases? I mean, now I'm sure there's going to be more people coming to you, asking you for their relatives who are American citizens who've also been either killed or disappeared, like the two cases you just mentioned. What would you think of the possibilities of that? What would you do if this does present itself?
So I first of all, I would be honored to speak to anyone who has information about a potential case.
Yes.
There's no guarantee that it's possible to bring a case. Everything is a careful combination of the facts of the case and how the law applies to the facts.
Yes.
And so we can never say in advance absolutely yes or no, it's possible. But it always starts with a conversation, and it starts with doing some initial fact-finding and understanding exactly what happened, who knows more information about it.
Especially that in custody, it's so much harder to know.
Absolutely, it's very difficult. On the other hand, it is possible to get evidence of those who've been detained.
Yes.
I mean, for one thing, we of course have the photos of the defector Caesar.
Yes.
And so we have thousands of photos.
Of examples of what could it look like?
Exactly, exactly. The other possibility is that among those 700,000 documents that have been collected, there are arrest orders. There are lists of people that were detained. There are orders to transfer detainees. And so it might be possible, for example, to search some of these lists that have been obtained and see if there's any information on people that have disappeared, whether it's American citizens or others.
And there's the Sednaya cases too that the State Department released also a year ago or so, which was during the Obama administration time, where there were people getting executed, 50 person a day.
Yes.
Were getting executed.
Yes.
So could that be also another evidence of how detainees are being treated?
It certainly could, because again, you're going to see with any individual victim, whether it's these two Americans who have disappeared or many Syrians who've died in custody, you're going to see that they were part of a pattern. It's what we call a pattern crime.
Yes.
This is a crime, it's not one murder, it's not two murders, it's tens of thousands of murders. It's tens of thousands of incidents of torture, sometimes horrific sexual violence against detainees. And when you see that at the level of tens of thousands, you know that this is an official policy.
Yes.
It's not just, one bad jailer in a prison who's abusing people. It's not a bad apple. It's the entire bunch. And so I think that looking for patterns of criminality, looking for systematic policies, that's one of the key lines of evidence that could be used in an individual case.
Before I go to the international situation, I have a couple of questions. First of all, how are you able, and you said that it will link you to Bashar al-Assad himself giving the orders. how could you do the same thing for these systematic tortures and killings that are happening in the detainee centers inside of Syria? And, what are the implications of that to basically put Bashar al-Assad's name in these cases? The second one would be how to force the Assad regime into, basically follow those court orders, like now in the Marie Colvin's case, $302 million.
Yeah, so one of the challenges for us is how do you connect a crime committed in the basement of an intelligence office to the president or to the head of the intelligence agency or other senior officials. One of the ways that you do it is by seeing that the policies were authorized. So I mentioned a document in August 2011 that called for military security operations against these different groups of individuals.
Who are innocent. That's just demonstrators, organizers of demonstrators, and people who are filming.
Exactly. Why do you need a military operation against someone who's filming?
Yes.
Or giving an interview to the media?
Yeah.
So we tracked some specific examples of journalists being targeted as a result of those orders. But the reality is that those orders, which were distributed all across the country, those orders directly resulted in tens of thousands of Syrians being arrested, many of whom tortured, many of whom killed. And so that's why I say some of the key pieces of evidence in the Marie Colvin case will also likely be key pieces of evidence in future cases for Syrians, cases involving torture and detention, not necessarily cases involving the military attacks.
Yes.
But so the question then is, how do you establish that the senior officials are responsible? Well, under international law, there's a doctrine that really goes back deep in history, but most recently has been used by the international criminal tribunals in Yugoslavia, Rwanda, the International Criminal Court, and it was used at the Nuremberg Tribunal after World War II. This is called command responsibility. And the idea is that if you have someone like Bashar al-Assad, who's the head of the armed forces in Syria, if he knows or should have known, based on all the information in front of him, that these crimes were being committed by his subordinates, and he had the ability to prevent it or to punish the perpetrators, and he didn't, then he's guilty for them as if he had committed them himself. And so I'm sure that the president was too careful to ever sign an order specifically authorizing any crime, but we don't need to prove that.
Exactly.
We can show that he had the ability to prevent this, he had the ability to punish people. And when has there ever been an honest, good faith investigation done by the Syrian regime of crimes like the killing of Marie Colvin or of torture in the detention centers? I mean, show me one investigation that has been done. I don't think it exists. I don't think the regime even claims that it does that.
Do you get worried about the Assad regime finding out, for example, names of people that you already know that were implicated in these cases and maybe killing them themselves to get rid of any extra evidence linking Bashar al-Assad to these people?
Well, of course, it is a big concern. I mean, the security issues surrounding these types of accountability efforts are foremost on everyone's minds. I think the regime has certainly a history of trying to eliminate who it perceives as threats.
Yes.
I think that there is still an active opposition. There are many Syrians now outside of the country who feel safer and feel that they have the ability to at least speak with national authorities. And there are national authorities in the United States and across Europe that are collecting evidence and have opened investigations into the crimes committed in the Syrian conflict. And to that extent, I think that is the best opportunity for witnesses or people with information to confidentially speak with lawyers like myself or with national authorities and other international investigators. But of course, it can be very dangerous to speak openly and to speak in the public about it.
Yes. What do you think, the ways to get that money from the Assad regime, from Bashar al-Assad and his regime, in cases like Marie Colvin, do they have accounts offshore that the United States can locate and take over?
So this is the next challenge for us right now, is that it's because you win a judgment in court doesn't mean that you automatically get the money. You have to actually find assets of the Assad regime. There are many assets that have been seized, frozen by the US government, European governments, Potentially, it might be possible to enforce the judgment against some of those seized assets. I think the other thing is that historically in these types of cases, successful plaintiffs have investigated commercial investments by the Assad regime and other governments overseas. The other thing is that this judgment can last a very long time. So it might be a decade from now.
Yes.
But we'll still be hunting for assets, and hunting for commercial property, investments, things like that. And the hope really is, of course, to compensate Marie Colvin's family for all of the harm, the pain that they've gone through, but also to try to put money that's collected to good use. Marie Colvin was committed to humanitarian causes. She was committed, first of all, to covering conflict.
Yes.
And the important role that war correspondents play all around the world in revealing the truth, which so often, particularly autocratic governments try to hide the truth and just, put out propaganda. It's the role of journalists to expose them. And also Marie was very deeply committed to the Syrian people. She was committed to telling the story of Syrian civilians trapped, behind the siege lines from their perspective. And that's why she stayed with them and ultimately sacrificed her life. And so our hope really is that some good can come out of this, both for Marie Colvin's legacy, but also for the Syrian people.
So are you saying that some of that money would be used to help people from Syria, or?
Hopefully, yes. I mean, if it's possible to recover some of it, then yes, hopefully it could also be put to good use for humanitarian causes and, yeah.
Yes, so okay, that's good to know. Actually, I want to ask you about the international efforts that you already work, and some of the lawyers and former judges like Ambassador Stephen Rapp, who's been working on the Assad regime crimes internationally as well. And you said that you already kind of have some collaboration with them. There are criminal cases against Bashar al-Assad and his regime in Europe as well. Tell us a little bit more about those cases and the potential, especially after now you won a case in an American court. I mean, how could that support and help the other cases in Europe, for example?
Yeah, I think the important thing to understand is that this is a collaborative international effort. And the evidence that we've put to use in the Marie Colvin case, we've also made available to other victims, to prosecutors and investigators in Europe and from the international organizations like the United Nations. And so it's really, I think every case assists another case. So what we have seen so far are criminal complaints filed in Germany, in France, most recently also in Austria and in Spain. Those cases, unlike our case, those cases are criminal and they are against specific individual officials. The goal at this initial stage is to have judges and prosecutors investigate the complaints, develop evidence, and eventually file for arrest warrants against Syrian officials. These will be international arrest warrants. I think it's unlikely that some of the senior Syrian officials are going to be traveling. But the hope is that some of these criminal cases in Europe will see Interpol issue international arrest warrants. And it might take years, but someday you might find a former Syrian intelligence officer, a military officer, someone from Bashar's cabinet taking a vacation somewhere in Europe or anywhere around the world, and the local authorities actually enforcing these arrest warrants.
Yes.
That's really the goal. It's a long-term goal. But there is an entire network of international lawyers, judges, prosecutors, all collaborating. And the amount of evidence that this international effort has developed is really like nothing we've ever seen in international justice.
Oh, so this is unprecedented.
It's unprecedented. The sheer amount of evidence that's been collected, even at this early stage. I say early because in international justice, cases don't go to trial very often for many years after a conflict has ended.
Yes.
The cases from Rwanda, from Yugoslavia, some of those cases are still in the courts.
Yes.
With the Syrian conflict, I think this was really one of the first times that a mass of evidence in terms of witness statements, documents, was collected while the war was still happening, while the crime was still being committed.
Yeah.
And I think that sets up really an unprecedented opportunity. On the one hand, it can be frustrating because it seems like why aren't more cases being filed? Why
Yes.
aren't more convictions, judgments, arrest warrants being issued?
Yeah.
But we're very early in this process. What is very promising is the fact that there is evidence.
That Assad is not going to get away with what he'd done.
It's very easy for officials to think that they'll get away when there's no proof.
Yes.
There is proof.
Yeah.
It's a question now of generating the political will in capitals around the world, within the United Nations, to ensure that there is no impunity for crimes committed in Syria.
People get like scared when they, kind of compare him with Bashir, for example, the Sudani. Like he was convicted, nothing happened. What is the difference here? Why could not Assad get away with what al-Bashir got away with so far?
Yeah. Well, I would emphasize so far, because justice especially, I mean, it's very difficult to hold a head of state, a president, accountable. So the hope is that eventually, eventually justice will come for these very senior, very powerful, political figures. I think another difference, however, is the sheer amount of evidence that has already been collected against Assad and against members of his regime.
More than the Sudani cases and the south of Sudan?
From my experience, yes, there is more evidence from Syria.
There's more evidence.
There's more evidence, and that's partly both to really the courageous efforts of Syrians themselves. Members of the opposition, people who didn't identify as opposition, but who just believed in human rights and the truth, and collected photographs, collected documents, spoke to people, got the names of people who disappeared, and made sure that international allies learned about that, made sure that documents made it escape from the country and are being preserved in archives now.
Yes.
That all is, that's very new. That's not something that we necessarily saw in the early 2000s out of Darfur, for example. And it's also a function of new technologies.
Yes.
The fact that you have the internet, that you have cell phones, that you really have the ability to preserve evidence by anyone.
Yeah.
Civilians in the streets can gather evidence of war crimes now. And so I think those factors, now it's a question of there are hundreds and thousands of videos. There are very important organizations. There's a group called Syrian Archive that has collected hundreds of thousands of videos. And preserve them. And it's a very, they're using scientific, technological expertise to create proper systems to preserve all this evidence, to analyze it, and to make it available to prosecutors in the future. So I think that's why there is reason to be hopeful, because when you're trying to convince a prosecutor or any government to hold these types of criminals accountable, it's incredibly difficult, first of all, because it's political. It could create diplomatic tension.
Yes.
The easiest answer for them to say, no, this is too difficult or this is too expensive, is to say, well, there's not enough evidence.
Yes.
And it would be too difficult for us to gather the evidence.
Yeah. But when there's so many evidence.
Exactly. You're taking away one of the main objections to it and say, we've got the evidence. All we need is the day in court.
Exactly. Scott, last but not the least, you told me something very important before we started about collection of evidence for the Assad regime collaborating with ISIS. This is one of the most, I think, would be very crucial for the United States, because ISIS is the main enemy and threat to our national security here at home. How do you think, I want to know more about this, because that's a debate that some people in Washington keep saying, oh, we don't have evidence of that, even though we know that Assad and his regime bought oil from ISIS, they attacked the rebels together in some cases. But what do you have in terms of a court case?
Yeah. So I'm not myself bringing the case, but I wanted to point out for your attention that there is another case in Washington, D.C., in federal court, that is a similar civil suit against the Assad regime for providing material support to ISIS. And that case was filed by the families of the American hostages, like Stephen Sotloff, like Jim Foley, who were captured by ISIS and tortured and executed by them.
Yes.
Those cases are very important to watch, because you're going to see evidence presented in court showing that the Assad regime purchased oil, made payments, facilitated the business transactions of ISIS. Because, of course, ISIS is not just a terrorist organization, it also took control of the oil fields, it controlled the economy. So what we expect to see presented in court in some of these cases is going to be evidence that the Assad regime, first of all, purchased oil from ISIS, but second of all, that they also facilitated the business transactions that ISIS used to finance its whole operations. It appears that there's evidence that there were middlemen connected with the Assad regime that were helping ISIS to do business, that were facilitating its sale of oil, that might even have been involved in arms sales and other material support. I mean, for example, just
arms sales to ISIS?
Well, it's quite possible, and there was a lot of black market flows of, if not arms, other materials necessary for fighting.
Okay.
Right? So ISIS, we know that ISIS, had a great need. Everybody in the conflict had a great need for things like concrete. You need concrete to build bunkers, to build barriers. Those types of materials that were necessary for ISIS to control the areas that it operated in, there it appears to be that there's evidence. I mean, I think we should wait and see how it's presented in court and see what the court decides on it. But within the next year, we can expect to see a ruling by an American court on that evidence. And we're optimistic that that's going to establish that the Assad regime is also liable for supporting ISIS.
For supporting ISIS. And there will be, hopefully, concrete evidence about all of these things that you just mentioned.
That's what we're hoping to see.
Yes.
It's not my case,
You're
so
not,
I can't promise you. I can promise you that we have the evidence of Marie Colvin's killing.
Yes.
But I'm just saying it's something to look out for in the coming year. Keep an eye on this decision that we expect from an American court next year.
Next year.
It could be in 2019. It could
For
be
the case of
2020.
Jane Foley and
Stephen Sotloff.
Stephen Satloff.
Yes.
Who were captured and killed by ISIS.
Exactly.
This is very interesting to look at. I'm sure we'll have you again. Would love to have you again, Scott, to hear more about this and other cases. Thank you so much for your time, and congratulations on the Marie Colvin case.
Thank you.
In this part of the episode, I'll be talking to Marie's sister, Cat Colvin, to discuss her life, her career, and how her case sheds light on the Assad regime and its targeting of journalists, and to discuss the latest movie about Marie's life, A Private War. Thank you so much, Cat Colvin, for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
First, I want to salute your courageous efforts with your family to continuing your hard work on shedding the light on Marie's life and her story, and therefore shedding light on what happened in Syria and what continues to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a long journey, but really felt very strongly that I couldn't let her death go with no accountability. Really, I started out for personal reasons, but, as you mentioned, as I went along, I really wanted to draw attention to the suffering of the Syrian people and let them know that we haven't forgotten them, and also to the plight of journalists who are risking their lives every day to bring the news to the public.
Where do you think this courage came, to Marie to put herself in that situation, knowing that there's a regime that's systematically targeting civilians? She reported it live on television. That took a lot of courage that many other journalists, even though they want to cover and they're interested in covering wars, but this was one of the most dangerous situations we've seen, especially with a cruel regime like the Assad.
Yeah, Marie really judged it important enough to go in. She covered a lot of she had a lot of dangerous assignments, and she covered a lot of wars. This was, as she reported, by far the most horrific targeting of civilians, and she judged it, worth risking her life. She certainly was not unafraid. She just was able to overcome her fear for what she considered to be a more important issue and something that the world needed to see firsthand.
Now, I had on Scott earlier, and we talked about the significance of basically having a federal court judge saying that the Assad regime deliberately and systematically targeted Marie and killed her, along with another photographer, a French photographer, and obviously the civilians that were with her in the compound. How, to you and your family, who worked so hard for years to get this case heard and obviously get this verdict, how did it feel?
It felt it felt like an incredible vindication. You know, having it recognized by a court, having a court validate after reviewing so much evidence that a lot of Syrian people risked their lives to get out to us. And for her to write such a passionate judgment was more than I'd hoped for. You know, sometimes these judgments can be very dry, but I think the evidence that we submitted was so powerful and so clear, and the attack was so egregious that the judge herself felt very strongly about the issue, and that comes through in the language of the judgment and obviously the size of the award. So, you know, a short celebration. I think Marie would be laughing. You know, if our roles had been reversed, I'm sure Marie would have done something much quicker and more dramatic, but she was always very supportive of whatever I did. And, you know, used to make fun of me for being a lawyer. So I think she'd really get a kick out of this.
You know, Kat, to you now, do you think that you know, since you feel that, you know, you vindicted Marie, do you think that this is where the road would end for your efforts, along with your family, to shed more light on this story? Where do you think your next step would be in terms of this case?
This is definitely only the beginning. I have a few goals that I'll still be pursuing. Maybe the most important, I'd say the most important, or the one I care the most about, is to have criminal charges brought against the perpetrators of this murder. I can't bring criminal charges myself, but I'm hoping that the evidence that we've collected and translated and, you know, made public will allow criminal charges to be brought. I also plan to pursue, you know, every penny of this judgment. I don't have any illusions that that's going to be quick, or even that it'll have the punitive impact that, you know, the judge intended with such a large award. But I would like to be an annoyance and a thorn in the toe of the Assad regime for as long as I can, and to continue to bring attention to these issues of, you know, the just horrific treatment of the Syrian people and refugees, as well as protection of journalists.
You know, I was talking to Scott yesterday about the award and the reward. And basically what it is that, you know, the Assad regime has a lot of money outside of the country. And we're hearing about new sanctions by the United States that we might see implemented. Is there a specific way that you think that you and the family will be able to collect that money from the Assad regime?
Well, you know, I really defer to Scott on how we go about it. It wasn't my primary goal, but one thing I would love to do, and I have shared this with my lawyers, is there's the possibility of attaching other assets like boats. And, you know, my sister was an avid sailor. She loved being on the water, and she had a wonderful sense of humor, which doesn't always come through, but a wonderful and very Black sense of humor. So I'd love to have a boat, attach a boat and have a big party. And after that, you know, I would like to if I can collect money, to put it to good work and to the things that Marie cared about.
What would that be?
Well, we set up a fund in her name. It's called the Marie Colvin Fund. And our mission is to support humanitarian and human rights issues, as well as the education and protection of journalists.
So those will be the main goals for the organization that you're creating.
Right,
and that
after we have the big party celebrating her life.
Exactly. You know, I wanted to also ask you about the documentary and the movie. So there's a new movie that came out that's going to be actually put in movie theaters around the country and possibly in other countries as well, about Marie's life and basically what happened in Syria. Would you and your family part of that movie in any way?
No, we weren't involved in it. But I did see it. Matthew Heineman, the director, was kind enough to have my family view it for the first time in a private screening. And it was pretty emotional to watch. But I thought he did a good job in portraying Marie's life, her professional life.
What about I mean, so you guys approve of the movie?
We didn't really have any, approval or disapproval rights. But I thought Rosamund Pike had a brilliant performance. She really, it was very distracting for me to watch it the first time because she did really take on Marie's persona very impressively. So, everything from her hair to her mannerisms, I thought she really captured Marie.
Okay. What about the documentary? Because Scott also told us about the documentary that came out on Marie's life. Do you think the documentary was more accurate than the movie?
Oh, the documentary was definitely more accurate. Paul Conroy. It was based on the book by Paul Conroy of the last, their last assignment together. I feel personally very invested in the documentary. Because of Paul's experience and because it includes the real description of what happened, from Marie's friends and actual footage. So I thought it was just incredible.
Many people here talk about the Assad regime and its systematical targeting of journalists, civilians, demonstrators, human rights activists, etc. Did you feel that there was a personal vengeance for you in the family to actually take on the Assad regime because of the systematic targeting that, we know what the results were for Marie, but many other people who were still disappeared or been murdered?
No, absolutely. I still get emotional thinking about it, but my initial motivation was, to avenge Marie's death. I was very, very close to her, and I still miss her. Imagine having a sister as wonderful as she was. But something about that Marie and I share is an empathy for people. And so to Marie, seeing the suffering of the Syrian people motivated her to go in and try to bring that home to the rest of us. And for me, I often think of all of the Syrians who have lost, sisters and parents and children, and I feel a very deep empathy. The Syrian community here in the United States was extremely kind, thoughtful, and supportive following Marie's death, and I always remember that. So I do feel a close connection.
Finally, would you like to say a word, to the people who are going to be watching you, all over the Middle East and Europe, but especially Arab speakers and people inside of Syria?
I would love to. I would, a big part of the lawsuit is that I hope people hear my voice, and I hope that the Syrian people hear my voice. It's a very small cry in the wilderness, and I don't have any illusion that I'm going to change the path of this war. But it is important to me that they know that I haven't forgotten it.
I want to thank you so much, Kat. I would love to have you again in the future and keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Best of luck. That was it for tonight's episode. Thank you for watching us. Good night.